So welcome, friends, colleagues, and students. I'd like to bring this webinar to order. My name is Barbara Singer. I am a Senior Program Associate with Progress at the University of Maryland. I am pleased to welcome you to our newest installment of our Distinguished Speaker series. I think we are all in for a very thought-provoking session today, featuring the innovative work of Dr. Desmond Patton from the University of Pennsylvania. A quick overview of our time today. First, we will hear from Progress co-director Dr. Woody Kessel, who will then be followed by Dr. Patton. Following Dr. Patton's presentation, we will have a Q&A that will be moderated by myself and Dr. Kessel. While participant microphones are disabled, we welcome and we do encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A function at any time during our presentation to pose questions. The meeting is being recorded, and we will post this recording on the Progress website and also on YouTube, alongside our previous Distinguished Speaker Series events. Without further ado, let me hand over the floor to Dr. Kessel for some opening remarks. Dr. Kessel, over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. And on behalf of Joe Richardson and myself, I want to add our welcome and thank you for all of you to join us to hear the thoughtful work that Desmond has been doing. And Desmond, first and foremost, thank you for joining us and sharing what you're doing in this important space to try to mitigate this tragic nightmare. And the data varies a little bit because the national data seems to be frozen at CDC, and the last 2023 data was about 128 people on average lose their lives to gun violence every day in this country, and varies quite a bit in different communities. Joe and I are fortunate enough to direct a unique effort at the University of Maryland. We work for President Darrell Pines, who took up this challenge of gun violence prevention as part of what he's calling grand challenges. And I think President Pines was motivated in part by the tragedy that we've all come to see virtually every single day on our streets, in our homes, in our communities, churches, synagogues, schools, and everywhere. And President Pines challenged Joe and I to organize an initiative focusing on a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach with community at the center of this. Our focus is to take translational science approach, a public health approach as well, to frankly see if we can contribute to, say, saving lives in the community. And it's across the full spectrum of the nightmare of gun violence, homicide, suicide, unintentional injury, and particularly, as a pediatrician, we just experienced this here in Maryland where a 4-year-old got hold of a weapon and thought it was a toy, and they died as a consequence of all of that. So again, let me thank you and get to our keynote speaker. Desmond, thank you. And as a fellow Philadelphian, we appreciate you joining us. Joe and I are hardcore Philadelphia people too. So Desmond, thank you again.
Yes, thank you. And before handing over to you, Dr. Patton, we do have some introductions for you. You have a very long resume, very accomplished, so we shortened it to just a little bit. So as Dr. Kessel mentioned, we at Progress, approach our work in a very multidisciplinary way, with a focus on community engagement through translational science. And this is why we are so thrilled to have you here with us today. Dr. Patton brings a unique blend of social science, data science, and community engaged approaches to violence prevention. He holds joint appointments in the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Annenberg School of Communication for the University of Pennsylvania. He also holds secondary appointments in the Department of Psychiatry at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Perelman School of Medicine. He is the founding director of Safe Lab, founding faculty director of the Penn Center for Inclusion, Innovation, and Technology, and chief innovation officer for the School of Social Policy and Practice. Professor Patton's groundbreaking research examines the relationship between social media and gun violence, grief, and loss, focusing on how online communities influence offline behavior. As a social work scientist, Dr. Patton identified that traditional data science methods often fail to capture the cultural and linguistic nuances of predominantly Black and Hispanic youth. In response, he developed the Contextual Analysis of Social Media Framework, CASM, which integrates culture, context, and inclusion into machine learning and computer vision analysis. He is also pioneering a new research agenda on joy, developing a practical and theoretical framework for integrating joy into AI model development as a tool for equity, imagination, and human connection. Well, Dr. Patton, it is certainly a joy to have you here with us today. Before we get started, I do want to remind our participants to please use the Zoom Q&A function to share questions at any time during the presentation. Afterwards, Dr. Kessel and I will moderate the questions with Dr. Patton as time allows. Welcome again, Dr. Patton, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much for having me. I'm going to attempt to seamlessly pull up my slides, so just bear with me one moment. Okay, I think we're here. So, good afternoon. It's good to be with you. And today I thought I would do something different. Instead of just kind of sharing with you kind of the latest paper, I want to talk about an upcoming book that I've been developing. And y'all, I've been developing this book for 5 years. So it's a long time coming, but I'm super excited to talk with you about it. So the book is titled Facing Gakirah. And it's a research memoir that follows more than a decade of work on social media related gun violence through the life and death of a 17-year-old child, Gakirah Barnes. And I chose the memoir form to be explicit about my positionality. As a Black researcher, my standpoint shaped what I saw, what I missed, and how I interpreted Gakirah's Twitter post, her city of Chicago, and the tools we use to study gun violence. So honestly, Gakirah taught me that social media is not a tool just sitting outside of everyday life. It is an ecosystem in a neighborhood, and it learns you, it predicts you, and it curates what you want and sometimes what you fear. So for many young people, it's where identity is built, where relationships are tested, and joy and grief and conflict are experienced in real time. And as the tempo of posting and reacting quickens, platforms do not simply reflect all those emotions, they help to shape it. And so things can escalate tensions and also amplify harm if we don't pay close attention. And so this book that I'm sharing with you is a deliberate move away from just public health and social science approaches that start and end with the physical street. Hopefully, my research shows you how you can understand how folks communicate and express themselves through language on social media. And I did this by tracking Gakirah's expressions on Twitter. This is years ago at this point, over time. And I wanted to link her digital expressions to offline events in the neighborhoods in which she grew up. And the reality is that this analysis is slow, it's layered, and it's ethically demanding. And it shows how posts can signal grief, threats, play, performance, and care all at once. So this is Facing Gakirah. I just wanted to share a little bit more about me so that you understand the positions that I come from, how and why I approach this work in the way that I do. So I'm a social worker. I'm a communication scholar and a public interest technologist. And I think naming all that matters because it explains why my starting point is simple. I intend to, with every research project that I do, to honor the dignity and worth of every human being. And so those values shape the questions that I ask, the methods that I choose, and who was invited into that work. And so, as a communications scholar, I study how people use platforms in ways designers didn't anticipate. I pay close attention to the stories we tell about promise and harm and performance and play on social media. And as a technologist, I examine how machine learning, computer vision, and now large language models and generative AI can either clarify that context or erase it. My motivation for this work began in Chicago during my PhD program at the Crown Family School of Social Work at the University of Chicago. Gang-involved youth in the city taught me to see Twitter as part of the neighborhood map of safety and risk. And that lesson from those young people drives how and why I do this work. My work also names what not to do. I've written about the dangers of digital stop and frisk and the risk of using AI to predict individual acts. The focus is interpretation, not surveillance. And the goal is to generate insights that help schools and community orgs and platforms and policymakers respond to conflict and grief with care, not punishment. And this is how I do the work. I want to introduce you to the Safe Lab. This is my home base for my team. And we study how life moves across platforms in everyday life and then turn those insights into action. So this is how we work. We listen to youth and partners, and we analyze digital traces with mixed methods, and we build things that hopefully people want to use. That means practical guidance for practitioners, training students and community members, and developing prototypes that support care. And if you remember one thing, remember this. The Safe Lab is where research meets practice with ethics and upfront real world impact is always the goal. So I want to name the stakes. In the United States, firearms are now the leading cause of death for young people, and by the time this talk ends, another family will be grieving. Estimates from a former U.S. Surgeon General put a child or teen dying from gun violence roughly every 90 minutes. So even though we're seeing trends downward, it's still a public health epidemic. But why focus on social media? Because I believe it is part of the terrain where conflict grows. Posts do not sit still. They move through networks and collect comments and raise the temperature. What begins as a slight or a joke can become a public challenge that someone feels pressured to answer. So, reporters and practitioners have been seeing this pattern for years, and in a ProPublica report, they documented cases where online taunts and threats escalated into shootings. Violence interrupters describe an online to offline pipeline that spreads faster than their ability to intervene. So I truly believe that if we care about gun and community-based violence, we must pay close attention to the digital neighborhood. Again, this isn't to criminalize it, but to understand it well enough to cool it down. So if we believe that gun violence is an epidemic, then platforms are part of the environment where it spreads. And I treat them as places, not as just a virtual side room. So what happens online shapes what happens offline. Jokes, rumors, disrespect, grief, they move through the comments, the DMs. They pick up an audience and raise the stakes. But here's the thing, visibility, speed, and constant notification turn private tensions into public tests. We have seen incidents that trace back to these exchanges. And if you ignore this terrain, you might miss where risk and care are first showing up. So I want to ground this work conceptually. And so I sit this work in three frameworks. One, internet banking. Internet banging is a term that me and some colleagues from Chicago coined in 2013, and it describes how youth use platforms to perform identity and manage conflict, signaling attention and mourning friends, issuing challenges, and defending respect through posts, comments, images, and videos. The digital neighborhood, a term coined by Robin Stevens, treats online spaces like neighborhoods with norms and boundaries and roots of safety and risk alongside networks of support. And then Jeffrey Lane at Rutgers University coined digital street, which shows how everyday street logics migrate online, where visibility and surveillance and audience shape what people say and do. So here's how I use them. Internet banging helps me to code content as social action, so we can tell when grief play or threat is being performed. Digital neighborhood helps my team map how these messages travel, who they touch, and where support networks activate or falter. And then Digital Street helps us to read the stakes of visibility and reputation, spotting when performance pressures push a post towards escalation. And so together, these frames guide our methods and our ethics so that we can detect early risk, surface care, and design responses that cool conflict. So when you treat internet banging in the digital neighborhood and digital street as the ground you stand on, the next step becomes obvious. Read what people post as social action with real stakes. So what I've learned over the years is that conflict leaves traces before it erupts. In captions and comments and direct messages and grief status work and threat takes shape in front of a large audience. And when we read posts this way, I believe we can catch early moves and open a window for care and de-escalation. Interpretation is really important, and this is one of the first mistakes that I made in my work, and I talk about this in the book. I didn't know what young people were saying online. This was one of the most embarrassing moments as someone who, at the time, was relatively young. I felt I was hip. I thought I understood the language online. And it became really clear that the language that was before me was hyper local. Not only was it various forms of African American English, it was also layered with hyperlocal language that is based in the neighborhood. So, for example, someone posting two street names are not just posting about streets. They may also be indicating invisible boundaries between two gangs. But if you don't understand the context surrounding those two streets, you may miss the complete picture. And so language and being able to interpret language based on the original author's intended meaning became extremely important in this work. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the early insights, some of the qualitative work that I did that led up to me focusing on Gakirah Barnes. So in order for me to actually read this terrain, I had to start with the best teachers. And those individuals, I think, as you all probably are aware, are the people that are actually living in this environment. So my first study was a qualitative project with Eddie Bocanegra and his team. At that time, he was the executive director of the violence prevention program at the YMCA in Chicago. And so we spent time with gang-involved youth and violence outreach workers. And one of the most amazing things about this relationship with Eddie is that he pressed me as a research scholar on purpose and reciprocity. He didn't want me just starting a new research project with his young people and them not benefiting or understanding the relationship to the project. And so we listened first and we shared back what we heard and set the guardrails together with how we wanted to conduct our study. And so what we heard from youth and outreach workers was quite steady. Young people use platforms as part of a safety map. In my dissertation, I call this cognitive geocoding. And they were reading where to be and who was watching. Things like grief, humor, and threat can sit in the same post, which means outsiders may criminalize mourning or mistake play for provocation because you don't understand the words that are being used. Meaning may be coded and changes with audience and time. And I think cooling conflict has to be relational, and trust carries through the intervention. So that means not only the kind of practices that you see in the day-to-day physical interactions, but those same ways of being, those same relational connections need and have to show up online. And perhaps even more so because the screen creates these interesting dynamics that, if mismanaged, can create more distrust and more distance between users and people who are trying to support. And so this particular first study set my template, if you will. So we wanted to treat posts as human communication before their data. We wanted to build or share lexicon with youth and practitioners that hold interpretations accountable through member checks. And we studied how messages travel and how meaning shifts as the attention grows. And it's been really important to design for support in this space. And so this foundation led to me developing contextual methodologies like CASM, which is the contextual analysis social media approach, and to co-design this work aimed at cooling conflict along with what we call domain experts. These are young people who are from the neighborhoods in which we're studying, who provide us with deep contextual knowledge of how we should interpret language in context and nuance. These aren't research participants. These are consultants. These are experts on their lived reality. And so this book and the work that happened before me encountering Gakirah sets the groundwork for how and why I think the story of Gakirah Barnes 10 years later, 12 years later, remains critically important. And so this book, Facing Gakirah, Life and Death on the Digital Streets, is about her life. Gakirah became my patient zero for understanding how social media and street life interact. So Gakirah was a teenager who joked, mourned friends, managed reputation, and faced real-world danger in public view. On April 14th, 2014, at 17, she was killed by 9 bullets just blocked from her mother's home in Chicago in the Woodlawn neighborhood, and also just blocks from where I studied at the University of Chicago. She was Chantel's daughter, a sister, a twin, an American girl. Born 13 minutes before her twin brother, she carried a name her mother chose for its meaning of the sun, and to her family, she was Sunshine. Her Twitter archive is a record of decisions, feelings, and pressures unfolding in real time. Her Twitter handle was at Taekwon Assassin. And she created this Twitter handle as a result of her really close friend, Taekwon Tyler, being murdered in front of her at a house party when they were very young. So, following these posts over years, her post with her friends and folks in her network taught me to read the language with context, to verify interpretations with people closest to the story, and hopefully to design ethical and responsible methods that recognize grief and play alongside threat. That is why Gakirah is central here. In death, she showed me what we need to notice and how to study it responsibly. And so here is what the work looks like up close. You will see Gakirah's words as they appeared to her audience. Hyperlocal language, grief for a friend, jokes and bravado, lines that might read as a challenge or a warning, sometimes all of that happening in the same post. And what I came to understand and also appreciate is that reading this work is slow. Every quote needs context. Who was it for? And what happened that day to structure the language? How an emoji might land in their circle versus, with me as a professor. And whether memorial is being misled as menace. So we read with youth partners and outreach workers, and we checked our interpretations together, and we watched how replies and quote tweets change the temperature. And so we always wanted to see grief and play, threat, and care without flattening the person who wrote it. And so what you saw is that those first couple of tweets were tweets that we would categorize as aggression, and we would talk with our domain experts to make sure that our understanding of what was being communicated would be identified and deemed aggressive to them within the neighborhood context. Oftentimes, the posts that we would see would be lyrics from a popular hip hop or drill song. And that would become really complicated because it wasn't always clear if the lyric was intended for its actual meaning, like were the words intended for an individual or a group, or in some instances, when we would talk to young people, they said, well, I just liked the lyrics and I posted them. They were not targeted towards anyone. They had no additional meaning. But that's really hard for the self-selected audience to make meaning of, and even harder when people who are outside of the context who might be trying to read this for, say, policing to make clear and accurate decisions about what's being communicated. But alongside those grief expressions alongside those aggressive communications were also grief. And one of the things that Gakirah forced me to do in her death was to reckon with her humanity. And this was a second mistake that I made. You see, as a social scientist trained to attack problems with rigor and science, looking at people through a humanistic lens with the diversity of who they are as individuals, their structural conditions, their family context, the pain and trauma that they experience was not always the first place to start. And for me, I had imbibed a lot of supremacist and toxic ideas of Black children who live in communities with high rates of gun violence. And so when I set out to develop research my questions focused on finding aggression, finding bad actors. Tell me how bad Gakirah was and how bad she was using Twitter. But what Gakirah did is that she forced me to see the complexity of her human experience, and grief was rooted in that experience. When I talked to her mom as I've been writing this book, her mom said that Gakirah was going to her funeral every single month. And so this is a child who probably experienced more grief, more loss in her 17 years of life than probably most of us or many of us would experience in a lifetime. So that is kind of the contextual, kind of qualitative grounding. I'm giving you kind of insights for how we had started our early qualitative work, how we partnered with youth, the theoretical underpinnings, and the kind of language analysis that we were doing. And this was all leading up to an approach that utilizes earlier forms of AI to then scale this work up. And so now we recognize that we have been talking to young people that helped us to form opinions about the categories that we wanted to analyze. Now we wanted to test whether those categories hung closely to actual communication on social media platforms. In order to do that well, I needed to partner with computer scientists who had expertise in social media analysis and text summarization. So these are some of my long-standing colleagues. I have worked with Kathy McEwen, who was an expert in text summarization, and we started work together in 2015. I had moved from the University of Michigan, where I was an assistant professor, to Columbia University, and began this work of analyzing Gakirah's Twitter feed alongside Kathy McEwen. And then Dr. Shifu Chang, who was now the Dean of Engineering at Columbia University, worked with me to think about the images that we saw, because oftentimes the text we would see would be accompanied by an image that would further contextualize the text to help us to really understand what was being communicated online. And so we would apply computer vision tools and techniques to analyzing that. So with Kathy and Shifu, we developed a set of experiments to analyze Gakirah's Twitter profile in a variety of different ways. And so in the book, I talk about what it means to be a Black scholar, analyzing the language of Black children, some of the opportunities that using early forms of AI contributed to in terms of being able to look at large amounts of text, But then, as you might imagine, there was a lot of challenge and a lot of complexity that I will get into around AI's inability to understand nuance, to understand African American English, and be able to parse that out in a way that's actually helpful and useful for violence prevention. And so I want to talk to you about some of those early experiments. So in our first study, we used natural language processing and we asked a simple question. Can we read Twitter language around Gakirah in context well enough to spot patterns that sometimes move offline? And so we started with translation. With youth and outreach partners, we built a guide that maps local slang, emoji, and references to plain English and paired it with an affect dictionary to read emotional tone. And on that foundation, we trained classifiers to flag two signals we cared about, loss and aggression. And so what we learned is that the AI tool was able to identify expressions of loss with around a 62% accuracy. And then also identify expressions of aggression with around 63% accuracy. So that means the natural language processing tool could identify that category correctly 62 and 63% of the time correctly. Now, this is not 100%. This are not great accuracy scores, but it indicated to us that there's something there that these tools can most of the time correctly identify some of the nuances in language. But what's missing, right? Should we add more data? What if we had more context? What if we engage with experts more to get closer to deep meaning? And would the tool get better if we add additional layers to it, if we bring more humanity to the approach? So let's see. And so we then decided to let's add more data and let's have more context. So this is the next experiment. So we moved from that early experiment, which is really was a really small experiment. We only looked at around 800 posts. So in the data science world, that is tiny, tiny, tiny. But because the AI tools sucked, they were terrible at reading African American English. It was really helpful to start small and to think about all the mistakes and errors and then see if we can add more data and get more context and see if that might make the tool better. And so we went from a thick data approach with small amount of data to a bigger data approach. And the goal was to get more meaning. And so the corpus grew to about 1 million tweets from around 300 accounts. And these 300 individuals are individuals that had some relationship or some network connection to Gakirah on Twitter at this particular time around 2014. And we were doing this work at a time right before she was murdered and then right after she was murdered because we wanted to see what was the language of individuals in her network before her particular death. And then we also wanted to see if their language changed or might there be any forms of retaliation that happens after she was murdered as well. We added translation guidelines, effect scoring, and network analysis so that we can watch the language and attention move across time. So scale didn't replace close reading. We kept qualitative labeling in the loop, not just binary tags of aggression or loss, but we added labels that could mark core exchanges, shifting audiences, and memorials that can turn into arguments. And I mean, memorial like people grieving others online. And then also jokes that can harden and turn into threats. And so these are the moments that automated systems oftentimes miss. So the language is, as I've mentioned before, hyper-local and layered. And so it always requires in-depth read, not fast ones. And so the payoff with having more context was really important. And so we were able to increase our accuracy measure, which is an F score, from 62 and 63% to 70 and 71%. And so that told us that having more context was helpful in our ability to accurately identify labels. So again, we're not identifying people. We're not saying that this language led to violence. What we're saying is that can we find the language that might tell us something about how people talk about violence on digital platforms? But the question that I think remains is like, well, should we be reading this language? Is understanding this language and interpreting the language of Black youth in digital platforms, does this help us to think about intervention in new and inviting ways, or does this create new pathways and pipelines for mass incarceration? These are the questions that have always kept me up at night, and always kind of worry me about these types of tools. But I think I've netted out in a way that says if we work with youth and community partners, if we develop ethical and responsible guidelines, and if we are constantly checking whether or not these tools are being helpful or harmful, then I think that this could be a helpful tool if done in community, not in isolation. And so those early computational studies taught me the limit of scale with fluency. And so more data helped us to see patterns, but the signals themselves were coded in ways a fast model could not read on their own. And so I think this is, and here's why this matters to me. I think overt and covert aggression blur together on digital timelines. A line can be a dare, a lyric, a joke, or a warning, depending on who is watching and when it's posted. Inside jokes and sarcasm carry a lot of message. Emoji, hashtag, nicknames, flip meaning, and the same combo can land as closeness, mockery, or threat. So these signals are the work, and if we can't read them, we criminalize grief and we overlook real risk and train models to be confidently wrong. So we keep humans in the loop always with labeling and context, and we check with youth and practitioners to ensure that we are doing this work properly. So one of the key indicators here is that we need a different kind of expertise because the first pass readings of posts are often wrong, right? And so there's so much room for error. So, and the stakes are high, as I've mentioned. And so we have always partnered with youth. These are our youth domain experts. These are youth from various communities who we would find through partnerships with community organizations. And we would hire them as domain experts in my lab, and we would pay them the same rate with which we would pay a PhD student working on research. And we would conduct analysis of language together. They would be given a set of Twitter posts, and they would give us direct meaning. They would help us think about context or any other nuances that perhaps the untrained eye would oftentimes miss in this space. And so when you invite people to teach you their code, you take on a duty of care. And so in my conversation with youth and families who are concerned about gun violence, the question always comes fast: is the work that you're doing just another form of surveillance? And as I've said, I've always shared that concern, and I've wrestled with these tensions in the study. So here's where we hold the line and what I've learned from families. Families want safety and real world tools for protection. Our work cannot become digital stop and frisk, and we co-design with community partners who set the questions, the boundaries, and the use cases. Consent has to go beyond traditional IRB forms with plain language around risk and options, and real agency to opt in to having your data analyzed, or to opt out if you decide to change your mind. So in the book, I spend a lot of time on a big transition in our work, a focus on grief instead of aggression, which is a understanding that I learned from Gakirah. And so we started with a blunt question: does grief lead to aggression? And what we actually saw again and again was grief first. Posts about loss, pain, love from a friend, and the pull to stay connected were always there. Memorial dates, playlists, prayer hands, inside nicknames. And from a distance, some of it reads sharp. You know, you're seeing curse words and other language that if you're not from the community, you might not understand. But up close, and when we talked to community members and youth, we understood it as mourning and grief. And so that insight changed how we work. If you treat every post as a threat, you criminalize grief. And if you read grief in context, you see where care moves in. And so we added labels for memorials and anniversaries. We tracked how mourning spreads through a network and studied when grief cools as a space heats up. And so the practice is this: read for humanity first, then for heat. And that's how we got closer to what a post is doing when outreach workers should decide to intervene or meet young people where they are. And so in a study that we published in Nature's digital medicine, we traced those timelines, and in our data set, we saw a clear pattern. Grief oftentimes came first, and about like 2 days, we saw posts becoming more aggressive as individuals who were in their network began to make disrespectful comments around what they were posting. And so we saw a young 16-year-old who was using Twitter to process grief. Someone would then see that, not like them, be from an opposing crew, clicker gang, disrespect that post. And then the original author's language shifted to aggression. People will start to comment on the aggression, and then you see comments where people are now ready to meet up and do something about something that started off as being a place to process grief. So, given what we know, that grief oftentimes comes first and opens a short window to act, I think this is how we might move. When memorials or lost posts appear, name them and check in early. Use timelines and structured listening to hear patterns we would miss in hallways, and build a simple grief calendar that anticipates anniversaries and memorial dates, and map directionality so that we know who cools a thread and who heats it up, and then route outreach through those individuals who are able to cool. And what's interesting is that when I talked about this work a few months ago when I was at the University of Maryland campus, one of the Gen Z outreach workers had an incident that was happening on Instagram in real time. And he and I were able to have a conversation about ways in which we could cool the aggression that was building up on Instagram, because oftentimes folks get locked into a misinterpretation because there's a lack of trust. And so we had to in in the moment think through ways in which we can help to cool some of those quick interpretations down. So here's a frame that guides practice. The street shows up on the screen, and the same currencies move both spaces: respect, recognition, belonging, watchful eyes. So a slight in a caption can invite a reply on a corner. So a face-to-face argument can reappear online for the audience that missed it. So theory helps us to use those loops so that we can read arcs in social media communication, not just as isolated posts. And then places travel too. Neighborhoods surface through posts on familiar blocks, inside jokes about landmarks, and quiet references to who belongs where. And those cues shape who speaks, who goes quiet, and when a thread pulls in spectators who raise the stakes. So treat place signals as part of the message, not as the background. And what's become really clear is that online behavior is super messy. So visibility games, drill aesthetics, and loose networks blur affiliations and make automatic labels overconfident. And so that does not end with computational work. It sets the terms. If we're going to think about the utility of AI, we have to build AI systems and models that account for performance, place, and audience, and that keep human readers in the loop who know the actual understanding and the code of what's being communicated. So here's what the book adds that I think a stack of research articles can't. It gives a grounded account of how social media related gun violence takes shape and why studying it is so hard. You see the loops of respect, grief, performance across time, not just as snapshots. You can also see as instruments in the research. You can also see the instruments of research. And in the book, I try really hard to show where I almost got it wrong and how bias creeps in when you frame questions, label posts, and design intervention, and what it takes to correct those courses of action. And so the book really tries to be a guide for ethical, community-centered AI anchored in social work values and reflexivity. And I name the assumptions, I check them with youth and partners, and adjust the tools when interpretation slips. And the goal is to offer some practical moves for using digital expression as a form of care. So I wanted to just offer some insight to action that are informed by my study of Gakirah and individuals in her network, right? And so when a public grief post appears in a consensus stream, it can trigger outreach within 24 to 48 hours, led by people who already have trust, like schools, community groups, and credible messengers. I think it's really important to keep choices front and center and to send a short, direct message with a menu of resources. Invite to an opt-in grief circle if needed, and loop in social workers, care workers for coordinated follow-up. It's always great to think about how you may add trained peer digital interrupters who can cool threads, who can post supportive language and redirect attention to care. And then I think it's always nice to set a simple cadence, one touch in the first day, a second within 72 hours, and then a check at day 14. So think about the continuity of care that can be applied to a digital online life as well. Another thing that I have found really useful is to deepen my partnerships with community groups and train and learn together. And at the end of my book about Gakirah, I talk about how Gakirah has inspired me to create a host of programs with nonprofit organizations to train young people to use their lived experience as expertise, not only to do work in their own communities, but to think about this type of work as new career opportunities. How do we use lived expertise to build a workforce of folks who can either work in tech companies or build their own companies where their lived experience is a form of care that we can train and develop together and scale together. So one of those places is the Brownsville Community Justice Center in Brownsville, New York. And we built a hands-on studio where local youth connect technology with social justice. We co-taught community interviewing, product thinking, and evaluation, and then applied those skills to prototype tools for conflict de-escalation, neighborhood storytelling, and safety mapping. And so the outcome is practical skill and civic leadership, plus a pathway into entry-level tech and research roles that keeps talent rooted locally. And the point is to grow community digital care by preparing the youth who live this work to design the tools that they need. We also need a context-first standard for AI in this work. I don't believe that AI is the solution. I think AI can be a tool, but not the tool. I think we have to keep humans in the loop for annotation and review and record uncertainty rather than just smoothing it away. We have to document the failures that occur in this space, and then reinvent when need be as well. I also want to talk about the guardrails. And so, as you can see, I try to strike a middle of the road ground with the application of emerging technologies and AI in this critically important space. And so, I think, you start with community consent pathways that are ongoing, specific, and reversible. So, start with people. People can opt in or opt out or change the limits in terms of your engagement with their social media at any point if things change. I think every use case in this space is co-reviewed with a community advisory group before the data moves. And so I think it's important to establish those relationships first. I think you absolutely have to secure data and to think about who has access to the data. And I think that should be a non-negotiable. And then encrypting all of it to ensure that this data is not being used for surveillance. And of course, have all the other protections that we normally have, storing identifiers, separate spaces, restrictions, and all those things. But I think oftentimes because it's digital and because when you sign up for social media platforms that you're kind of giving away some of your agency, but oftentimes in the academic space, that means you don't need the same level of protections. But I say that we absolutely do because of the vulnerabilities that exist in what people are saying online. Like I'm currently a part of legal case where young people were talking about particular events in their neighborhood that then led to them being convicted for an act. And oftentimes there was just a knowingness of who was looking at your social media communication, how your communication can be challenged or misunderstood. This is not something that's commonly understood within a lot of communities. And so I think making sure that we have this understanding for young people and communities is really important. And so the advocacy work that I think accompanies these types of strategies is equally as important to how we do that research as well. And I think we have to continue to establish concrete partnerships and wins that we can chase together. I love this idea of pairing research teams with schools and community orgs and platform product groups so that ideas move from study to feature. Because a part of the challenge is that many large technology platforms don't understand that the features that they create can lead to harm because they're not from those communities and they haven't studied the effects of those features. And so, but if we can bring insights from those of you who are in communities and are seeing the effects of like live features in your community and developing use cases together that we can then use to advocate and articulate why this is harmful is really, really useful in these spaces. And so to make this real beyond just, conversation, I think institutions closest to young people have to move first. And I think we also have to have conversations about schools and city governments. And you may not be able to see, I'm realizing that some of my slides may not be coming through clearly. I will send this all so that you can have these slides as well. But I think in schools, I think we have to fold social emotional learning into the digital world. And what I mean by that is teaching students and adults how to recognize feelings online and to name them and respond in ways that reduce harm. So we're not really having conversations in schools about the digital world. Children are being taught what it means to be a citizen, and you're learning state government and um, federal government, but we're not learning about what it means to be a citizen of the digital world. And this is getting further complicated as we're also having conversations about banning social media and cell phones in schools. We could probably have long conversations about whether or not that is helpful or not. But what I am concerned about is that we are missing opportunities to have conversations with young people about what it means to be online. And I don't want us to opt out of that. And I think that as we think about violence prevention training, we need to be having conversations around how we help people to have thriving and healthy experiences online as well. And I think for cities, we need to fund non-punitive digital outreach teams based in public health. We need them in libraries or youth agencies to help. And so the help is local and trusted. And I think we have to put public health in charge of social media crisis responses with policing use only as a last resort. So we might consider you having written agreements that spell out purpose, data limits, and evaluation of social media, and publish basic metrics on response times and completed referrals and community satisfaction. And I think this is hopefully how cities can turn listening into care at scale as well. I think we have to continue to build capacity for this work. I think we need to train people, outreach workers, students, community members, to be able to read digital signals with care and to give them a simple shared protocol. For example, what does grief look like online? Acknowledge what and when acknowledgement of what's happening actually helps people, and how do we route people to support when we are able to identify when grief is showing up in these spaces? And then we have to put governance in place before any tool actually touches practice. And so we're having this conversation about research, but the governance of AI and these tools is equally as important. We have to create a standing community board with real veto power over deployment of these AI tools, where the systems can be used by whom and for what purposes, and to give the boards access to documentation, register harms and evaluation plans so that we can then be studying when we're doing well and when we're messing up in these spaces as well. And so we have to empower community groups, empower organizations to set up their own governance around the utility of social media and AI in these spaces as well. And so here is what I want to leave us with. Much of what looks like heat online begins with heartbreak. And if we recognize grief early and meet it with care, we can change the arc before it hardens into retaliation. Timing matters. Our job is to notice and respond inside the window when language, attention, and audiences are shifting. And no one should be doing this work alone. Domain expertise is essential. Bring youth, families, outreach workers, clinicians, computer scientists, social scientists, and let their knowledge, their questions, methods, and guardrails. And then we always should be we should absolutely be broadening the table. Diverse voices are not, are extremely important in this space, and they change what we see and how we interpret what we're looking at in online spaces. All right, thank you so much. And if you're interested in staying connected with me, here are the spaces where we can chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patton. That was brilliant. And I really appreciate the summary that you provided of your most recent research. Super interesting, and I certainly learned a lot. And we have several questions queued up for you from participants. So if you are okay, we'll just go ahead and dive in.
Good.
Okay, great. Well, first and foremost, there is a student who is asking just a little bit more about your background. Just we know you're a social scientist, but the student is asking more about how you became an author, and also, have you practiced social work? Are you a social worker? So if you could give a little bit more context to how you have become the esteemed professor you are today.
I love this question. Thank you. I have an MSW from the University of Michigan. I have never like held a traditional social work job. And so I am someone that went from undergrad to master's to PhD and then into the academy. However, probably like many of you, I've used all of my summers to work with young people. And so when I wasn't in school, I always had internships with young people. I worked in communities. I worked in violence prevention organizations. And so while I didn't have the traditional 9 to 5 as a social worker, I would say all of my experiences coming through my training situated me within a community context. But I would say the thing that brought me into this space quite firmly is that when I was a PhD student, I worked for the consortium on Chicago school research. So I was getting a PhD, but also working almost full time for the consortium. And I was spending time with K through 8 students who were then moving into the high school environment. And the thing that kind of got me focused on community violence was talking to young people who were AB students in 8th grade and then were C, D, and failing students in high school. And the thing that kept happening to them is that that's when violence would increase in their lives. And so for all the students, for many of the students that I was interviewing or chatting with as a part of my research portfolio, either they had been shot at, their siblings had been shot at, their parents had been killed. It felt every day. I was shocked. And I was studying test scores and grades, but most of my students couldn't get to their building without worrying about gun violence. And so this interest in gun violence and in particular interest in social media came from talking to young people who were affording me the opportunity to learn more about their life. The book is, writing a book is actually new for me. So I am trained as kind of a hardcore social scientist. And in the social work discipline, writing books was not a necessity for getting tenure. And so I'm not in a field where books were the norm for getting tenure. But because I have studied one person for 10 years and have had such um, interesting moments in this process, eye-opening moments, mistakes, insights. I thought that the form that would allow me to tell those stories and to actually bring myself into the research experience would be through a book. And so I wanted to write a book because I thought that it gave me a long form to talk about the complexities of this work. Because oftentimes people get really excited about the use of AI and gun violence. I want to temper that a little bit. I think it's important, and I think we absolutely can't study gun violence in 2026 without talking about social media. But I don't want people to then start using large language models and trying to predict bad actors. And so I think a book allows me to talk about my own mistakes as a scholar and kind of how I'm thinking about where the field should go based on some of the challenges and opportunities that I've had.
And in the book, do you talk about how you came across Gakirah initially?
Great question. So Jakira's story was in the Chicago Sun-Times. And so I learned about her right after she died. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was sitting at my desk at the University of Michigan, and I always read the Chicago newspapers because I follow the shooting discussions that were happening in those articles. I found them to be really useful. And there was a story and the headline was Chicago's gun-toting gang girl, Little Snoop. And so they were referring to Gakirah just like the character from The Wire, the popular HBO show. And Little Snoop was a female gang member who would shoot first, ask questions later. And so Gakirah's story was hyper sensationalized, and I thought what was interesting in this news article was that it was for me one of the first times where I saw it list someone's social media handle as a way of describing their life. And so I was able to then connect to Jakira's Twitter profile because it was listed in the Chicago Sun-Times article.
That's great. Thank you so much. Dr. Hissel, do you have a question before we head back over to the Q&A that from our participants?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. First, Desmond, big thank you, big hugs. The richness of what you were presenting and the thoughtfulness and the sensitivity, all come through. So just a super thank you. I actually have two questions. And the first one is, if I use the research jargon, it relates to selection bias. In other words, the question becomes who posts and who doesn't post. The whole notion of are there two groups of people, and this gets to the broader issue of, in general, there are active people who share everything, and there are people who withhold, keep it sort of inside. So the first question is the difference potentially between people who share on social media, very transparent, very public, not at all in any way private. And then the second question, a little more technical, how do the events that are shared on social media compare with events that the police report and or that the non-social media, the newspaper articles? How do those sources of marking events and maybe potential precursors? But the first question is just a little more about who chooses to post, and what have you learned about why they choose to post versus those that obviously may have been in the same circumstance but have chosen not to share on social media?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I think it's important to remember the time with which I was studying Jakira as well, which is from 2014 and then many years after. And what we know from Pew Research findings is that most teens, and in particular, most Black teens, are on social media every single day, and they spend an enormous amount of their day online. And so even if a teen is not posting online, they are living online. So I think that's an important um, entry point. It's unclear to me who posts, and it's also unclear to me, particularly within a gun violence context, if and why that matters, right? Because so many teens are living online, even if you are not the poster, the way in which you live your in-person life might be a reflection of what you have seen online or what you have heard in person about what people have posted online. And so one dynamic that would happen is that someone can say, well, such and such said something about you on social. You could be an individual who is not online, which happens a lot. Not every teen is a posting teen online, but because social media is so relevant to how you live offline, the behaviors of the people who do post could have impact on people who are not posting as well. I think we see so many different types of people who post online, right? And I think it's important to think about we have folks who are lurkers who spend a lot of time just kind of watching and observing and not engaging. We have people who are lurkers but engage in direct messaging, right? And so a lot of the conversation or interactions may not happen in public view, but may be communicated online through direct message. Another thing is that, teens have intricate and dynamic relationships with each other. So, for example, say you and I were friends, and I share with you my password. And then we're no longer friends, and we're 16, and I'm going to get back at you. And so I'm going to screenshot all of your direct messages and send them to someone else. So there are folks who engage in private conversations online that may not show up publicly, but could have the same types of impact that we see. And then there are the people who are very public. And I think public um, behavior is driven by lots of things. One of the things that we have to talk about is kind of the celebrity and performativity that's connected to online life. And so when you're a teen, being highly connected, being known, being engaged happens through your willingness to be visible in online spaces. And so it could be, you could be an introvert but want to become a part of the in crowd. And so you make yourself more visible through various forms of performativity and engagement online. I used to show a video in my class of this young male who was an extreme introvert, but used to kind of keyboard gangbang online by starting fights online, but was not a gang involved, was not a part of that life by any means. But the people who he was talking about found out where he lived and they videotaped them. They on their cell phone on Facebook Live going to his house and they beat him up at his house because he was hiding behind the keyboard. And so there are individuals like that who don't understand the impact of their keyboard behavior, and the features on the platform allow for connection and scalability and then potential violence. And then, as I've mentioned before, we can't forget this group. There are a lot of people who are just being themselves online and they don't have any connection to violence, and yet interpretation matters, right? And so some things get out of control. You lose control over the narrative when you're just sharing about you're in a new relationship or you're not feeling well or whatever it might be. You're sharing so much of your life, but because of the context of where you are and who you're connected to, interpretation can vary in many different ways. To your point around the connection to police, I'm unclear. And so one of the gaps in the research is that we don't really know the causal relationship between what people post online to actual events. And so this was a great dissertation study, postdoc study. To be able to link the two is really important. The complexity around doing this again is really trying to figure out, well, what is actual ground truth? What is a post that is actually worth the time of focus, right? And so oftentimes some of the challenges that we have is that we don't look at the posting behavior of white youth in the same way we look at black and brown youth. And so how would we know because someone uses tough language and they're from a particular community, is that post what we have to be focused on? Is that the post that's going to lead to violence? And we're not looking at other youth in wealthier communities or white youth in the same way. And so there's always been this question around the ethics of how we do that kind of triage work to make sure that we're not just saying because you grew up in a neighborhood with high rates of violence, then that is by function language and content that we must look at.
Thank you for that
Great, Desmond.
response.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Barb, were there other questions that were coming in?
We have so many questions. It's wonderful. You've provoked a lot of thoughts. Um, so the next question, thanks for your talk. I've been a fan of your work. I'm just going to read it verbatim. The ethical complexities with this research are so important. When discussing community consent pathways to digital media, are you getting consent for each individual? If so, how do you handle that? What happens? What happens consent for shared posts? So multiple people. You alluded to that a little bit as you were
Yeah.
speaking about social media in general. I guess when people post, it's out there now. So, beyond that, and you did talk about community consent. Could you talk a little bit more about consent as
Yeah.
it goes as ethics? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I think, this is something I write about in the book. Hindsight is 2020. And so I did not engage in all of these strategies that I now think are particularly important. And part of what I do in the book is that I talk about the complexities of being on the tenure track and needing to get research done and in making really hard decisions, right? And so legally, and within the context of what I'm supposed to be doing as a professor, I followed the protocols around how we treat data, right? And so, particularly, if the social media posts are public, then you technically do not have to have consent in order to use them as a part of a research study. That never really sat well with me, and yet I needed to figure out how to analyze data. So the my intervention for myself was to seek community and approval. So what that would mean is I would take examples from the things that I was looking at on Twitter, and I would visit community spaces, so churches who had community groups, local nonprofits that are youth serving or violence prevention organizations, and I would talk to the youth in those spaces and the folks that work there and ask them, I'm thinking about doing this study. If I did this study, how would you feel about that? And so my intervention was, well, it would virtually be impossible to get consent from millions of people on Twitter around their publicly available Twitter posts. But what I tried to do is to go to those communities and say, I'm thinking about doing this study. Are you okay with a study that does something like this? And I was never told no. Because, as you might imagine, folks who are directly impacted by violence, in many instances, are very interested in tools and opportunities that can keep their young people safe. And young people were very interested. They told me this time and time again, as long as you're not using this research to hurt me and you're using it to actually keep me safe, then I'm okay with you using it this way. So this is what I was hearing. Again, this is years ago. I think what the strategy would need to be, we need to constantly be talking to young people about these approaches. Maybe there's new insights, new ways of knowing that we might be missing, and we might need to change protocols and approaches. And the IRBs have gotten a little bit better, but they're not actually super helpful in this space. They're more lax than you might want them to be. And so the question that you have to think about, I think, as a researcher is, and you have to make tough choices around what is it that I can do that is legal and standard in academia, but how do my personal values shape the kind of work that I want to do in communities? Where do things meet up, and where do things and where is there disagreement? And hopefully you'll make a decision that is informed by how you want to conduct work in a way that is in partnership, in true partnership with communities.
Thank you for that answer to a very complex question. I'm sure we could do a webinar only
Oh
on
yeah.
that. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I do want to provide one more piece of information that came through the Q&A. Just somebody who said that they really appreciated your integration of the digital flow of street culture, internet banging, and code of the tweet. Or the street, I guess. There's of the tweet, sorry, because they had learned about it in one of their classes. So it was nice for them to see it in being used in real life. So I do want to say thank you to all of our participants and hand the floor back over to Dr. Kessel to just close and appreciate our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Barb, and certainly Des, a big shout out. It just was stimulating and thoughtful and raised, numerous questions. But before I just close, uh, a big shout out to certainly Barbara for moderating this, and two of our wonderful people, our Deputy Director, Mike Dravis, and Charlotte Knight, one of our young people, smart, bright young people who helped us organize in the background. So a big thank you to them, as well as, to you, Des. And you just, you stimulated lots of thoughts, and particularly the one that I, as a pediatrician, was probably the most impressed with was engaging young people as experts, and the respect and regard and thoughtfulness. In my pursuit of adolescent medicine, the first and foremost thing was, it was a struggle between trying to get the young people and not their parents in the same room at the same time, that have the respect and regard and the honesty and frankly the relationship that information shared with me was not to be shared with others. So I think, in addition to all of the thoughtful work and results and how we use this information and how it could be helpful, and look, we're all trying to prevent these tragedies from happening, the 2 minutes of decision making and what provokes it, and even when we see tragedies and mass shooters, trying to piece back where there are indicators in social media, where they're messaging, where they're shared ideas. Did somebody share this? But your work is just incredible, and we certainly appreciate and value you as a colleague and as a partner, and in this quest to frankly save lives and use science to make a difference. And as you pointed out, it's not for academic advancement, but it's investing to be able to make a difference and stop this nightmare from continuing. The number one cause of death for kids is just something in my 50 plus years as a pediatrician is incomprehensible to me. So
Thank you.
thank you again, and thank you all for participating. And we'll continue with this dialogue series and have other innovative speakers and share some work and thoughts. And we're posted online, and Des is posted online, and we've got a website. And for further conversations, please reach out to us. We would love to just engage with all of you. So again, Des, big thank you, and I'm glad you didn't have to shovel too much snow to get to the webinar today.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you all.